So I'm kind of thinking about this whole world nation thing in the US, Israel, and some of these various influencers, they get into talking about capitalism and communism and supporting a type of Christianization in the approach of the US on the world stage pertaining to capitalism. And I think what's interesting is that under the surface of these conversations about capitalism, communism, and things like that, really is this sense of a battleground for using the market to pressure other groups into forms of conversion or compliance or preservation of their types of religious beliefs and whatnot to some degree. And then coinciding with certain types of competing interpretations of beliefs, because there's also different sects of Christianity in different countries that maybe it's like Christian, what they might, I'm just going to use general terms. It's not the exact practice of various countries in terms of, say, a pure capitalist approach or a pure communist approach. But just in general terms, there's some countries that they'll probably categorize as like maybe Christian Catholic communist or Protestant capitalist or just atheistic communist or let's see, what would this other country be labeled as? It's kind of a mixture, just another, I guess, like Christian group, a power. But anyway, at some level, though, it seems like what people are making reference to is their beliefs behind it. And a lot of times it doesn't even really seem like, so let's see. I was saying that maybe I would go into this conversation, give some quick notes on some of the conversations they had with debates with communists and capitalists in America. And I don't know, maybe I'll get to that. It was just kind of like a generalized approach. In general terms, I'm not exactly against every aspect of, maybe what they talk about in terms of the free market and things like that, and being cautious against an economy that is run and controlled by the government. But all these things are just kind of, like they almost seem a little bit relative pertaining to whatever the ideals of the group leveraging their economic approach. And so at some level, when you're thinking of some forms of capitalistic gain, if we weren't looking at it as leverage against other power systems and people were just introducing a political approach and saying, hey, this is a strategy for accounting for the social aspect of human beings that is the shared space in relation to personal freedoms to grow and develop their own type of gains, it's kind of loosely, like in some way posing, maybe a free market or capitalist approach with like a communist, the inescapable shared space of existence approach. But we're not just talking about that. I mean, I think sometimes when people are approaching it as that, it's almost as though they're trying to solve for the ideal sense of what would create and generate a cohesive, functional society. But a lot of times it seems like they're forgetting to add to the equation that we're not really to that point yet. There's forms of these like capitalist or communist approaches that seem to be used to directly or misused as a power force against a competing power force. And so in some ways, let's just say there was like maybe an exploited version of capitalism that basically just protects certain investors and games the system so that it has this control over populations. And then because the way that resources have to continue to be managed, and because a controlling entity doesn't really solve for the sustainable aspect, as earthlings with these like certain resources that have to be shifted through certain time sequences and whatnot, it just doesn't solve for that. And so it creates this sense of like a vacuum where it has to keep feeding itself. And so then it has to improperly cross over boundaries and borders, and to maintain a certain type of control. So then it inflicts warfare, and then it has to defend that approach, and then it encroaches over other countries and whatnot. So eventually then you can see how countries would then take on a competing force of, maybe if they're labeling it communism, which is a sense where they then say, well, you're controlling your population so that you can preserve your resources, so that you can be a defensive opposition to us. And in some ways, maybe that's true. Maybe that is what they're doing. And so then you find that groups will say, well, they are a oppositional force to us. And so now we have to increase this form of like weaponized capitalism, encroaching and devouring resources to feed itself. And then it becomes these battles for these ideals and recruiting people based on these ideals. Anyway, so along those lines, then it seems like if there was an improper, like under that type of storyline, if there was an improper power structure misusing this idea of capitalism, but then within it trying to preserve some forms of useful capitalism within it, in a protective space that draws in people to be beneficiaries of it, it both then attempts to justify itself, but then function on the outer level of it as like a corrupted version. In that event, if that were the case and it was an improper power structure, it would almost justify other countries then saying, hey, we can't, we have to guard our resources, and we can't let our citizens, we have to counter this power by having some measures of control over our population, so that we have control over our resources, so that we have a competitive defensive measure against this opposition. And so you could see why it would develop that type of counter reaction, and why it would then be deemed as a threat. And then why it would perpetuate that as a threat, because there's nowhere else to go except keep continuing to do that. And then eventually you'll find that under the surface of it is these sides of ideologies and whatnot. And then you'll find that because people are finding those ideologies help these function, they're going to want to counter those ideologies. And so it's all of these corrupted forms of improper power that never really resolve for itself and perpetuate itself and intensify and get worse and worse and worse. So I guess I'm just saying this in the sense of even taking a smaller sense, when some of these powers then even say in our country's politics happen in that sense, there is, as I had mentioned before, in the form of, if it becomes a Darwinian type selected power system, then you would find that if people are still striving to solve for this, like the social fabric of society, they would have to create a countermeasure to that, which would be a non-Darwinian system where they're dispersing levels of access to people to sustain society. And so you see that that's what helps, even though people are saying well, America's is successful because it's a capitalistic, system and it's not all or nothing. Like, there are some groups that you can look at, if they kind of play the system, if they come in and adhere to it, there can be some levels of success. But then you find ultimately when the going gets tough, they have to duplicate themselves onto the powers and fight those similar battles and justify along those similar lines. And it would be legitimate for them to say, well, we perceive our threat as those that are trying to undermine our control over this money and trying to distribute it to the population and But at the same time, so that might seem like a legitimate threat, like they're undermining us and whatnot. But at the same time, it's like a legitimate undermining because it's an improper control. And you find that there'll be these responses because of this improper control. People will want to undermine your beliefs and your ideologies because you're improperly using them. They're improper function of control and diminishing of their lives. And so you see all of these things. And so you see people, fighting along these lines of these powers and whatnot. It's not to say that there can't be, a better system, a better approach, and a different type of synthesizing of these things. And it's also not to say that some groups don't just become a power unto themselves, and then produce these countermeasures where some of their tactics in their competing system is propped up with certain type of substitutionary conduct. You see that on both sides. You see like the systems can't really sustain themselves with like a full transparency of their corruption. They have to then go behind the scenes and do all of these questionable antics. And so that's what people are starting to find out. And it's also not to say that, some people will say, okay, fine, let's just imagine that we agreed with you and you said like these approaches are corrupt and it's not really the functional ideals of capitalism or really the functional intentions of, say, communism. Or that at the very least it could justify some levels of control measures that countries take upon their own citizens to counterbalance this other dominating world power. So let's just say someone said, all right, we can kind of see that happens, but how would we get out of it? Because how would you minimize that? How would you de-escalate that? How would you use the measures to like de-escalate that? I think at some level, these repairing a lot of these improper ideologies. So you do see that people are, are cloaked over these improper systems, these improper control mechanisms as justification for these, like through these ideologies, which is just improper. So you see that's why people are approaching like religious theory or various cultural religious proposals and whatnot. And I also think at some level, like people can strategize on certain mechanisms, but on some level, looking at how to somehow or another repair for some sort of proper, fair distribution of the outcomes of the economy, some type of life resources, some type of access for people to develop their lives with and whatnot. I hear a lot of people talking about taxes and to that extent, and some people, there's a lot of disagreement on how taxes are used all around. Some are discouraged that it's going toward these war machines, and some are discouraged that it's going toward other funds and whatnot. But anyway, just along those lines of like strategic measures, and then de-escalating some of the weaponization against populations. For instance, we're finding more and more that even when there had been opportunities, like for Black Americans to de-escalate some, and provide other measures of support, even those seem to be just intentionally, strategically denied. And in some strange way, it seems like it's because they, some level of vulnerability, as feeling like you can't make corrective measures because you can't let the marginalized communities become too strong, or they'll want to topple the leadership, or what have you. And I mean, because of some of the treatment, you can see how people can feel that way. But at the same time, if you're working within communities, you see like that's not even for the most part people's intended, they have families and people to care for. They have other things they're invested in. And when there are fair opportunities, it really does help build communities up. And so you just see that state of paranoia is really coming from the leadership, and maybe because of the way that there's been improper control over communities, because you find that when there are opportunities to develop amongst various ones, it works. And it doesn't mean that things have to be in place forever. There could be stages of, say, proposals of certain corrective measures are in place, to the degree that it was imposed, maybe, I don't know, like certain generations can, it can then be, for instance, say like, I don't know, some people might say, well, we don't want to introduce policies that then we're trapped in or stuck in, whatever. But I think when there's favorable groups, they don't even think about that. They don't question like the longevity of things. And so it's just a strange standard to have, like, oh, we have to be like very cautious on how we allow for certain policies and approaches and whatnot. Whereas if there were ideas and options introduced, it usually does work to de-escalate in communities. And you're finding that if the numbers are shown that certain populations have had even more dire situations and increased increased lack of stability in communities, then you have to look at what are the other factors. But anyway, so if you're thinking about like providing various options and whatnot, and even if we think like, well, that can't be forever, like the thing is like things morph throughout years and generations, and once you accomplish some stage of stability, then you can kind of like reintroduce other stages of stability or integration or what have you. Or anyway, though, my point there is certain negotiations. So like if people, for one, like just learning today that some money, like billions of dollars, was blocked from being provided to the Black community because it came from outside countries and whatnot, with ties to other leadership that the U.S. maybe had question of whatever, but there could have been negotiations there. There could have been other avenues that the funds go through to ensure that it's going to like the right types of stabilizing of communities and whatnot. And it's just another one of those things where when the leadership becomes so paranoid, you can almost imagine what they would say, like, these funds are just going to fund terrorism in our streets and whatnot. And it's like, man, at some level, you have to stop saying that, because you're creating terrorism by these other methods that you're using, improperly imposing sanctions internally on citizens and externally on other countries. Like, you just have to start figuring out some other mechanisms of acclimating people into like shared society. You cannot continue in this improper control over populations. And then because that begets other survival methods, then say you can't do that because of these survival methods. And you just got to stop that. And so then it's like, okay, if your fear is that the money will go to improper places because they're your enemies of, the way that you've developed your country or your power system, then propose other mechanisms of distribution that it goes through. Make a deal about it can go here, it can go there, as opposed to intentionally continuing to sabotage the like success of different people groups that you deem like the marginalized that need to stay marginalized or what have you because of like historical conflicts. It's and then trying to self-justify and say, well, they're struggling because of this or because of that, da, da, da. And here's the thing, like, I'm not denying that there aren't developed conflicts or crime or other things, but when you look at the options to prevent it, to de-escalate it, to give other options, then those aren't even, necessarily considered as prevention either. And then it becomes this like other methods of shame people out of even wanting to ask or request. But it's like, that doesn't really stand, because none of the other groups that have had success have had it on their own. They've been given it or it's a part of these measures of, I guess you would say, I'm trying not to get into the fighting words, but, like theft of other resources, theft of other countries, and then given to others to start intentionally developing themselves. So basically nobody has ever created themselves by themselves. And the success that we see in this country, of course, it's not as though we don't want people to be successful, but if you truly were confident and there was an aspect of the integrity of your success, then there should be a universal component that you can see spreading that to other people. In that it's such a guarded, defensive space, seems like it's not really something that is like a universal application as much as a controlled measure. And, so I'm just kind of saying there are ways that there are degrees of which, so you can look at, okay, what are you paranoid about? What is the leadership rising to the heights of these controlled mechanisms and then inflicting basically war against their own population? This never works. Like that approach never works. It doesn't work for very long. And so what are the approaches? Like, if you come right out and say, well, all right, if we were to say it, if you were in our private meetings, we have to guard against this, or we have to guard against that, or we have to, what have you. And then you can ask, like, well, what are acclimating approaches that you can have some level of control over? If you don't trust, and this isn't even to say that it's accurate, maybe the other groups are saying, we're not even planning that. Or if they say, well, how do we know that? We don't know. We can't trust you. There's no trust between us, da-da-da. So, like it could be written into controlled measures of like distribution or acclimating or something to that effect. And it doesn't even, like, some approaches don't even have to be forever. I mean, I don't know. You could say, let's write this in as like 100-year proposal or a 50-year proposal, or and then having certain stages of transition, or that it has to meet certain stages of transition or something. I'm just thinking of that in terms of, say, like in our Native communities, there's things that, there's growing pains, along the lines of still developing and stabilizing our communities. But there is growth. I mean, we're reaching the point, though, where we have other stages of transition and what growth looks like to deliberate and think about and strategize. But it has worked, like some measures of groups and various ones negotiating for some of the needs has worked to, over time, start to develop our communities and whatnot. There's still things to work on where we still have to negotiate. A big thing that we negotiate is like also ideologies and things like that. That's why I also get into those discussions as well, because it's just a part of the makeup of the historic condition. And but I really do think, even though it's not like a perfect method, I mean, if we're looking at building better relations, that's different. But in that, we can't always count on that political negotiations and certain protocol for various agreements of de-escalating, and then some type of like curated economic development methods for certain populations and whatnot, according to like their historical need, actually does work to restabilize areas and populations and whatnot. And then over time, groups develop into negotiating through the courts and through these measures, because you've built a confidence in those measures, to negotiate the corrective measures of historical tensions and disagreements. And then that starts to develop. So we're reaching that stage. And so it's just kind of peculiar to see people eroding those stages where the thing that was implemented is finally starting to show levels of success. And then people are, kind of getting paranoid about it. And a major aspect of them even getting to that point, though, is really because there's differences in interpretation of Christianity. And that's also why I entered into that discussion as well. And I feel pretty confident about being able to, understand or at least propose some of the corrective measures along those lines. Like, we're trying to get to that point. But that's where it becomes kind of peculiar, where it's like at some level, people are trying to preserve the sense of Christianity, but on another level, they're not. They're trying to have improper control over populations. There's a lot of negotiations that go into it. People had felt that they didn't want to hear critiques of some of the accounts of certain institutions and their approaches and historical tensions. Anyway, that's another discussion to have there. I think that's kind of coming out a little bit more, where you're finding people getting defensive about finding that some of the institutions have had an improper economic power leverage and like some questionable things going on behind the scenes. And even along those lines, you kind of see different institutions pointing fingers at different ones or different denominations or different entities and whatnot. And it's not so much that there's like this standard of perfection that people must reach, as much as once it gets to the point where certain institutions, even in their imperfections and historical, like questionable antics and whatnot behind the scenes, and in some, in more extreme cases, like really horrific acts that they've done that have actually no place in being justified by God or any religion, But you find that it's because they're still a part of trying to maintain this power dynamic over other groups. And that's why people are calling them to account. It's not so much that, like there's an expectation of purity in their, history's messy and whatnot. Because I think if groups were more open to negotiating and saying, hey, let's relieve the plight of groups on a very basic level, people would be open to like giving grace through the imperfections of history and whatnot. But some of these groups have such a power behind the scenes that is tied to this dominance over other groups, and that's why people are putting pressure on them. And so there really is just this, it serves people to just come to the table and negotiate, because most people, if you give them the tools that they need to just start developing their own lives, that's what they want. People's attention gets placed on these attacks and these battles because you're not giving them any other option except to always fight for every little piece of everything and critique it to the last, unless if it refuse to release itself from improper control over people's lives. In the event that people are flexible and they produce some levels of nuance in it, then people are pretty generally flexible in their negotiations and get on with their lives. Even in the sense where, I think it was Lindsey Graham, he had said something where, and at the very least, he comes right out and says what he feels the level of threat is. And you know what? Maybe they just need to start doing that. Like, just tell us what your level of, your pending level of threat is. So the world can help you come up with ideas to strategize de-escalating these situations. And I think one of the things that he had said is so obviously he's going to be more on the side of the groups that they're part of the controlled measure against other groups. And they're going to feel like, hey, there's no way we're going to let up if we feel our lives are threatened by letting up. No matter how much you moralize it or throw a Christian theory at us, we're at the point where we're coming out and we're basically bluntly saying we're going to do what we need to do for our own self-preservation. Even if that if you have a plan for de-escalating that, where it can serve our needs, then perhaps we will consider it. But other than that, there's no consideration. I mean, they've kind of gotten to that point. Pure self-preservation at the cost of whatever the system or ideology or whatever. So if they're just coming out and saying, this felt threat against some of their alliances in Syria, against the other threat and whatnot, and then the threat that they would release some of these prisoners, some of the prisoners of war or the ISIS. And, just kind of even beginning to discuss that is okay, that does bring up a interesting topic though. These warring factions all over the place, most of them have prisoners of war, and people will come out and say basically that there's this assumption that God knows what happens in those places against various ones, right? And then there's also the notion of who's guarding them. They don't want they don't want to have their enemies freed and then regenerate to fight against them and da-da-da-da-da. And so, that kind of does bring up that sense of What can we do to alleviate something like that in this day and age where the, governing systems are kind of more networked? Is there a way where... So I remember, even though I push back on some of Sam Harris's stuff, I actually agree with a lot of stuff. There's some stuff I disagree and some stuff I agree with. And but anyway, I do remember him bringing up this topic along the lines of his discussions on free will and the sense of people kind of being a product of various conditions, and that we can make a judgment call as to their level of threat without a full condemnation of, well, he didn't say it like this, but basically he was kind of saying certain levels of threat to humanity, it makes sense to lock them up in prison or to isolate them from the rest of the population based on, your reasonable approach or assessment. He was even saying, if you could lock up a tornado, we would lock up our tornado, just simply because it's a threat to others. So he's trying to separate this sense of isolated, judgment, I guess you would say. Maybe that's not the right word. It was among the discussions on free will. So he was associating some of these arguments with these ideas that people aren't always in control of the conditions that they find themselves in. Anyway, but the main point there is if there is a proper assessment as to whether certain people are to be separated from shared society for everyone's safety, there is some sense of a reasonable approach to that, but it doesn't need to be exacerbated by... And this is interesting because he had kind of eased out of his more extreme approach, and this is later years, he was finally taking somewhat of a more reasoned stance to where it wasn't just the torture talk and stuff like that. But the idea there is, the main point is to protect society. It's not to induce prolonged suffering on various ones. So, along those lines, there does seem to be an argument for some level of, there's a lot that goes into that. I don't know if that people would even consider it. But the idea of de-escalating tensions by having a better approach to various prisoners of war and whatnot, does that mean that there needs to be transparency? Does it need to be, I don't know, something that the UN helps to report on and some outside entity? Because we're also finding this approach to even ICE, and before, when various groups were said to have been shipped out to other places. What are those conditions like? What, can the public have input on the societal effects of it? And, can there be a sense where, because some people might say, well, we can't open, I'm just imagining people will say, we can't open up that can of worms because these are just people we need to forget about. It's too much to imagine transparency on letting groups come in and report on what's going on, or having a working communication between those working there and imprisoned there. There's just too much, because once we start doing that, then it kind of comes out that maybe there needs to be some legal investigation to it, blah, 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 blah. You can imagine people saying that. But at the same time, it's another one of those examples that's generating these continual hostilities and whatnot. You even had Benjamin Netanyahu trying to justify this idea of going after hostages and obliterating a whole population. And that's in question, though. Some people said that was just a guise because he actually wasn't really doing the work, nor really took seriously the negotiations. So maybe that's not the best example, because he basically wasn't taking seriously the negotiating of the hostages. But under the idea, the main idea, though, is some groups will go to war over entire nations for what they perceive as happening to maybe some prisoners of war and whatnot. And so there's this question of, okay, if it could be that these people need to still remain separate from society, whatever, can there at least be transparency and communication between, and for updates on what's going on with them? And that could be a reduction of national hostilities against various ones. Can you negotiate what your legitimate level of threat is? Like, well, you don't want these imprisoned here, they need to be moved here, and if they're moved there under the watchful eye of these groups, then we'll make this deal with your country. Or if it also is the case where you say, okay, at this precedent set, we're going to be willing to make improvement stages, but there needs to be stages of improvement that, are realistic, blah, blah, da, 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 da. And I don't know, I'm just throwing out ideas here, improvement on the world stage, start getting the wheels turning, start thinking about it. What does it mean to, negotiate for the improvement of populations, reduce the levels of, because I know, some people would probably go in and sacrifice a whole city if it meant, getting back for something that someone improperly had done to their loved ones, whatever. And we need to stop that. We need to stop doing that back and forth. You hear horrific things that people are doing intentionally, and then it just doesn't stop. And then they keep saying, well, if we come to the table, we have to admit, we're paranoid about what you're going to do because what we did and what you did and what we did, and it goes back and forth and back and forth. So it's just trying to figure out how to stop that. How do you bring transparency? And then if they say, well, we can't start there because, in all honesty, there's too much corruption. Some people are there that shouldn't be there. Some people are, it's a precedent, it's a power struggle, and they're there. And then, maybe some people will say, well, these are things we can't bring out of the closet because we don't have enough manpower to bring a proper corrective legal measure to it. So then how do we do that? I think too, if you're thinking of manpower, you can imagine people will do the work. You could empower people and equip them to have access to different ones, and the public will do a lot of the work on their own, their loved ones. People have dedicated years of their lives to helping negotiate and manage the paperwork for their loved ones and different ones, and negotiate and do the grunt work. And so if it's a question of manpower, then it's how do you equip those that already want to do that to be able to do some of that work, the processing. It's kind of one of those things, where you lay out the need and you say, here's the concerns, here's the things that need to be met, here's the whole area of how we don't know how to meet those needs, and maybe we don't have manpower. What is it that you need? In a perfect world, if you had what you would need, in a perfect world, we wouldn't be in this situation, but if we were visited by some entity to give us some kind of empowerment to start or to begin doing these things, what is it? What's the need? Is it manpower? Is it this or that, or whatever? And because, some of this stuff on the world stage now just isn't working. There's plenty of things that are working. There are a lot of things that are working. There are improvements that are being made. And I guess, though, we can say sometimes massive levels of improvement can be destroyed by, a few things that just get out of line and then it topples, right? And so, anyway, just enough rambling for me today. I still do think, it is interesting to think, well, I talked about this already, interesting to think about how to approach the economy, on the world stage and meet the needs of various ones. And anyway, I'll just leave it at that for now and just keep considering some of these ideas, I guess, these various topics.